How is the situation in the Strait of Hormuz affecting the global economy? And is it putting pressure on Trump to push for at least a partial resolution to reopen the route?
It's, of course, the key. I think we have to remember Mark Twain's adage that war is God's way of teaching geography to Americans. And so once the war started, then Americans learned a little bit where Iran was and what the Strait of Hormuz is. And Americans heard repeatedly that 30% of the world's oil flows through the straits, and then they started to learn that downstream products, especially petrochemicals, urea, and other fertilizers, helium, surprisingly, metals, aluminum production, and so forth, because of the energy intensity in the Gulf region, are also produced and exported and travel through the Strait of Hormuz to world markets. So immediately upon the invasion, or the attack, I should say, on February 28th, oil prices and natural gas prices spiked. They rose initially about 50%, from $65 to $70 a barrel to over $100 a barrel. And then they have fluctuated since, depending on how closed or open the strait is and what the expectations are regarding a U.S. withdrawal of forces. Trump made everything astoundingly more complicated by responding to a ceasefire with a U.S. blockade on top of the Iranian control over the strait. So we have two blockades in this critical waterway, both of somewhat ambiguous nature. But the fact of the matter is the actual flow of oil, gas, and these other critical products to world markets has dropped dramatically until this moment. This has not been restored. And as we speak, Brent oil prices are a bit above $100 a barrel, which by any standard is very high, but they had reached $120 a barrel and higher just a few days ago. And it's because of this sense that the U.S. is probably backing down at this point that the prices have fallen sharply. Now, what is the effect of all of this? It is what economists call a supply shock. It means that unlike some economic downturns which come from a financial panic or a downturn that comes because of what John Maynard Keynes called a fall of aggregate demand, this is an economic crisis that comes from the basic hard fact that the physical supplies of energy and other inputs for production are suddenly cut. And that's a very dramatic kind of economic impact. It's so dramatic, I wrote my PhD dissertation 46 years ago on this question of the oil shocks of the 1970s, which had twice thrown the world economy into an extraordinarily painful downturn combined with a surge of inflation, an outcome that was christened stagflation. And I wrote, I think, the first book on worldwide stagflation as a result or an analysis of those two shocks. Well, what's happening now potentially is much, much worse than what happened in the 1970s. And the reason is that in the 1970s, the flow of supply was twice cut off. First, in the aftermath of the the 1973 war between Israel and its neighbors, and then in 1979 in the events of the Iranian Revolution. But those were a cutoff of supplies because of turmoil and political decisions, whereas what is potentially happening here is a physical destruction of the oil and gas fields and the infrastructure, the pipelines, the refineries, the ports that bring the oil and gas and the downstream products to world markets. And we've been hovering at the precipice, or we've been at the precipice of the physical destruction of the Gulf energy system ever since February 28th. Trump repeatedly said, I'm going to destroy everything in Iran. The Iranians, it was clear from the first hours, have the capacity to do the same to their neighbors in the Gulf to the west, the Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, and the others. And so we've been hovering close to the physical destruction of a major part of the world energy system. And that would have meant not just a downturn, but an economic crisis with a shadow at the length of many years, if not a decade or more. Would have been truly and would be truly catastrophic. We're not absolutely out of this yet. And Trump continually flirted with the idea of escalation. And every time he did so, the oil price surged because the markets and the speculators saw that there could potentially be a devastating destruction of the physical supply. Now, how does this affect economies? It affects every economy in the world because primary energy of oil and gas is an input to all production processes, sometimes directly and sometimes downstream. It affects electricity prices. It affects, of course, the price of petrol at the gas pump for motorists. It affects all transport and shipping costs. It affects food production. Nobody escapes that, whether you are self-sufficient in energy or an exporter or an importer, as long as your energy market is integrated with the world market. So the prices of oil and gas, and therefore the impact on the users of oil and gas and their downstream products, hit the U.S. economy the same way as they hit any other economy. Our gasoline prices soared. This immediately caused Trump to lose several percentage points of approval ratings in the polls, and caused every Republican political analyst to start screaming, stop this, before we have a devastating result in the November election. The U.S. is not closed to the world energy markets. In fact, Trump brags, and his most important backer, probably the oil industry, certainly one of the top 2 or 3 lobbyists in the U.S., they're exporting gas and oil products to world markets. So we're completely interconnected. And that means every manufacturing business, every factory in the United States, every motorist feels the same effect. What is different in different countries is what we call the income effect, not the supply effect. There's an income effect, which is negative if you are an oil importer. You're paying more for that oil. Not only is it more expensive for all the users, but you have a direct loss of income irrespective of the downstream effects on manufacturing or industrial production, simply that you have to put out more money to do whatever you were doing before. And if you are an oil exporter or neutral, that your imports and your exports roughly balance, you don't have a loss of income per se because your oil companies get a windfall that offsets the losses of income of the users of oil. That's not politically, by the way, a very acceptable point. Our oil companies in the United States, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and others, are having a windfall. Tell that to a U.S. Working class household that's paying vastly more for their gasoline and their other bills. They won't be very impressed by the so-called insulation of the U.S. from that negative income effect. They're experiencing a negative income effect. The oil companies are experiencing a windfall. That windfall, partly goes to Trump's campaign funds. That's the whole political lobbying aspect of it. It doesn't go back into the pockets of the working class people who are paying more for their energy. So you could say at a national level that the income effect nets out, that the windfalls of Chevron and ExxonMobil balance the losses of tens of millions of American households. But socially, politically, economically, that's not really balancing out. It is netting out in the pluses and minuses, but it's not evening out in the account of the impact. If I summarize all of this, on the production side, industrial companies, users of electricity, users of petroleum and downstream products, it doesn't matter whether your country is a net exporter, net importer, your industrial production side will suffer from a worldwide decline of energy resources. From an income effect, if you are a net exporter of oil and gas and related products, you can have a windfall, but that windfall may end up in the accounts of a few companies, whereas the negative effect of the households in the economy will be equally severe no matter where they live and whether they have a U.S. Or they have oil companies in their midst. And let me just add a little footnote, which is that Exxon and Chevron and other U.S. oil companies experiencing a windfall are U.S. domiciled companies, but a lot of the shares of those companies are foreign owned, actually. So the windfall isn't even a U.S. windfall per se. Maybe 20 or 25% of the shares of those companies are owned internationally by estimates that I've seen. And that means that it doesn't even net out in the simple balance sheet way of the U.S. Just being a net balance of petroleum products, because a lot of the windfall side actually goes to foreign owners rather than to American shareholders of those companies. All of this is to say, nobody is immune from this shock. And I haven't even talked about the second round, third round, fourth round effects that these shocks bring about. I've only talked about the most immediate effect of the supply side changes, because once you have this massive disruption to production, you have many feed-on effects in the financial markets. You have companies going bankrupt. You have governments that go into financial distress. Even the Gulf countries are at risk of financial distress, as you've been rightly describing with a lot of care. The way that the Emirates and other Gulf countries have gone to the U.S. Federal Reserve for a backstop, a swap line to protect them against a potential financial crisis. All of this means that there are many adverse cascading effects from what's already happened, this is already hurting badly tourism, air travel, the price at the gas pump, industrial production, food production. It's already hurting badly. But if Trump were to escalate and the result was a mass destruction of the hydrocarbon physical infrastructure of the Gulf region, the consequences would be, I would say, in excess of anything we have seen since the Second World War. And I think Trump has probably heard that in the last few weeks, to his great frustration. And I think he has been warned repeatedly, I hope so, that he has been warned repeatedly that escalation would not only most likely be militarily fruitless, but it would also most likely be economically devastating.
What needs to happen to reduce the supply shock from the Strait of Hormuz? And do you think the real obstacle is the lack of good faith diplomacy between the US and Iran?
I absolutely can. And I think you've nailed it. Of course, we don't have good faith in the United States. And this is not a rhetorical flourish or just a backhanded slap. It's a literal description of the behavior of the U.S. security state. For decades, the whole idea of the U.S. security apparatus is you don't need good faith, you just need dominance. Good faith is what you do if you are in a repeated interaction with another party, and so you behave according to some principle or some standard so that you can hold the other side to account in future interaction as well. It's the give and take of diplomacy. We know it in our own lives. This is how we presumably work with members of our family, business relationships, and so forth. You don't just cheat because there are consequences. You ruin your relationship with the counterparty. You ruin your reputation. For the United States, I would say uniquely in the world, the U.S. view has been different, which is that the only reputation the U.S. wants is that it can slam anyone that gets in the way. In other words, the reputation that it seeks is that of a bully rather than of a good faith counterpart. I think many countries find this surprising because there are normal interactions with other sides, even with other sides that they regard as deceitful or with a tendency towards deceit, is that at least there will be the motions of good faith. And so with the United States, it's really quite different. With the United States, you sit down with the negotiator and then you literally kill the negotiator that you're negotiating with. And Israel, in its bravado as a military Sparta backed by the United States, behaves even more ruthlessly in this way. The Israeli model is negotiate with nobody, but assassinate everyone you can get your hands on. And so the whole idea of good faith is not a concept in U.S. statecraft right now. The concept of U.S. statecraft is to scare the shit out of the other side. That has been the model for a long time. It's the model that famously is the model of the Athenian generals in Thucydides' account of Athens' warning to the island of Milos. You're with us or we destroy you. And that actually is the behavior. I have spent 25 years telling governments abroad, you better be careful, because this is how the actual behavior is. They will sit down with you. They will try to kill you. They will try to overthrow you. They will deliberately weaken your economy. They will try to crush your currency. They will try to create bank runs and so forth. Actually, I have to say I was pretty naive about this stuff for a long time until I watched it one after another, because it's so abnormal to behave this way. Almost all of us, even I think instinctively, know that what goes around comes around. You better be careful. You better behave, because very few of us experience the rush of unipolarity that the United States security class and apparatus and CIA and all the rest experienced, especially after 1991. With the Iranians, it's been something, because I know the Iranian negotiators. They're very polite. It's, of course, civilizational also. This is Persian culture. This is not only Iran. This is what you feel with the culture of 5,000 years. And they're very polite. And they said repeatedly in the last couple of years, we'd like to negotiate, but we'd like good faith. And I cringed every time that they said that, because, okay, you can negotiate, but don't expect good faith. Now, Donald Trump is the caricature or the cartoon of all of this, because his personal mentality and style is this to the most exaggerated extent. This is a man who was cheated on every contract, who drove multiple companies into bankruptcy through his false dealings and so on. What is an amazing fact is that he became president on 2 occasions, despite all of this, partly because he signaled to some group of Americans, this is the bully we really need. This is the bully who is going to kick the shit out of the people I don't like, whether it's the immigrants or the foreigners or the Iranians or the Chinese or whoever it is. And so his bullying was his selling point. And there is no good faith with Trump. The concept doesn't even exist at the personal level, but it really doesn't exist at the institutional level. It's not always been like this. The U.S. actually had sophisticated diplomacy at many times, and it was always to some extent a bully against small countries, but it had rather sophisticated diplomacy for decades. It's basically lost that after 1991, when the so-called unipolar moment came, because the class in power believed their own rhetoric, that now they really are all powerful. They can decide, they can choose. And as someone famously told a journalist in the Bush Jr. administration, we create our own reality. And that became the actual mode of statecraft. So there is no good faith. It doesn't mean you can't reach some agreements, but boy, you had better have those agreements essentially backed by Russia and China and others, and maybe in this context, Saudi Arabia and others, who have a strong incentive that the agreement actually be fulfilled. Because otherwise, if it's purely on a bilateral basis, it's worthless. And, you know, if we were, which we won't do right now because of time, but if we were to turn to Ukraine, the whole saga of ending up in war in Ukraine is one U.S. broken promise after another. Absolutely no good faith. From the commitment in February 1990 that NATO won't expand, to an agreement on February 21st, 2014 in Maidan that Yanukovych will continue as president and there will be elections later in the year, followed immediately by a coup that the United States immediately adopted, followed by the bad faith of not enforcing the Minsk II agreement, and on and on and on. It's bad faith. And this is, what I think even, for the Russian side, it was surprising how consistently it was bad faith for more than 20 years. And it's surprising for anyone that normally engages in negotiations to see this kind of behavior. But it is born of this very particular situation of the United States as believing itself to be the only country that counts, and therefore one that doesn't have to turn to the normal tools of iterated cooperation and reputational matters, which is what good faith invokes, but rather the idea we do what we want and we do it however we want because nobody can stop us.
If both sides are still exchanging fire, how can this be called a ceasefire? And is it something more serious than just a blockade?
Donald Trump has the same interpretation of ceasefire as Bibi Netanyahu. They're cut from the same cloth. They don't know what the word means. Now, I know Netanyahu knows what the word means, and what it means for Bibi Netanyahu, Nima, is that under a ceasefire, I can kill more people more efficiently. That's what it means. And that's what he's doing in Lebanon right now. He's not doing that in Gaza, and Naftali Bennett and others are angry at him for not doing it because IDF won't go down in those tunnels. And that's where Hamas is now. They're in those tunnels. And the IDF has told him pointedly, we're not going down in those tunnels. So Bennett and others are really angry with him because he's not finished, in their view, he's not finished eliminating Hamas in Gaza.
With the build-up of refueling aircraft, fighter jets, and weapons in the region, do you think preparations are underway for a short new phase of war, and how long could it last?
I think J.D. Vance, if that Atlantic piece is accurate, or even partly accurate, J.D. Vance is right to be concerned, because one of J.D. Vance's deep concerns, according to this article, is that we are using munitions that we would best keep at hand for other threats that are more important than Iran, that are really threats. So I don't know how to parse this. I know Larry Johnson was saying he thinks they're going to mount another major assault, Israel and the United States. That could very well be, but I'm not sure that I believe that, because one, the markets aren't right. And Trump never attacks unless the markets are positioned for his buddies to make lots of money. And secondly, and probably more importantly, I really don't see the constellation of forces and the disposition of those forces that would, on either side, Israel or the United States, that would make it a very effective attack. Now, they could just go ahead and attack anyway. I think they've proven time and time again that air power and air power alone is not going to do very much. I don't think they're crazy enough to put land power in there of any size. Maybe they might put some special forces in there. They'll get their ass handed to them just like before. So I'm not sure I agree with Larry that we're looking at an imminent attack. I could be wrong. I mean, this administration is stupid enough to prove me wrong, but I don't think we are. I think we're looking at a lot of hullabaloo, a lot of threat, and Donald Trump being very desperate to get enough threat ginned up to where he does really get something of a concession out of the Iranians. To this point, I can see nothing, absolutely nothing in the way of a concession that he's gotten out of the Iranians that would stick and that would satisfy them in terms of what he would give them back for that concession. Because you know what they want. And what they want, I think, is not transferable, you know, and especially things like, we must get you out of the region. We must have both primary and secondary sanctions lifted. I don't think they're going to give up those things. They'll give up their lives before they give up those things.
Is Iran setting these conditions knowing they won't be met, essentially signalling a return to the pre-war deadlock, but now with greater leverage, especially over the Strait of Hormuz?
I think very, very precedent-setting interview, if you will, with Vladimir Putin. We have a trip coming up by Donald Trump to the number one power in the world, which I think he's going to cancel. I don't think he's going. And we have a whole different situation in terms of the stacked allies against us in this conflict from the day we started it to the present time. I think it's very obvious that Russia is an ally of Iran that will do whatever it has to do to keep them from going down. And it's probably as obvious that China is angry and willing to do a lot in that regard itself. I don't know to what extent totally they will go. More satellites overhead, more diplomatic support, I don't know, but I think Xi Jinping is, and this is something I would not have said 6 or 7 months ago, maybe not even 6 weeks ago. Xi Jinping is mad. He's angry. He's angry with the United States of America. Not a good place to be if you're us. Someone said to me, we need to get our primacy back. I said, this was yesterday. I said, dude, our primacy went a long time ago. We are not prime in the world anymore. China is the number one power in the world, period, bar none. No discussion about it. Come on over. Let's talk about the dimensions of state power. China is the number one power in the world. The only dimension in which they're not globally the hegemon, if you will, and they don't like that term, is financial, and Xi Jinping has just declared he's going to take over that one. And there's no question in my mind he's going to be successful. Then there will be no sanctions, primary or secondary. There will be no banking system. There will be no SWIFT system. Eventually, there will probably be no oil consortium that consists of anything other than China, Russia, and the assets appertaining there too. You can take ours all day long. That fracked oil, $50, $60 to get out of the ground. Got to have the prices like now in order to make any money off of it and get it out of the ground, which Donald Trump is eating up. He loves it. The Permian Basin in Texas loves it because now their oil is viable on the world market. You get oil back down to where people can live with it again, where it's somewhere below $50 a barrel, and you can't frack. It's uneconomical to do it. You can do it, but you're going to lose a fortune.
With Iran's foreign minister travelling from Islamabad and Moscow to China, and Beijing signalling support despite US sanctions, does this reflect a coordinated strategy to bypass Western pressure?
He was essentially going to let the renminbi, over time, say a decade or so, work its way into 60, 70% of the world's GDP. He's already halfway there because that GDP is in Asia. And then present the world with a fait accompli. You cannot deal in the oil markets. You cannot deal anywhere. Commodity markets, whatever. You can't deal anywhere without the renminbi. You no longer need the dollar. The dollar is not the base currency. It's not the transactional currency. It's not the reserve currency. It's the renminbi. Got that, people? He's moved his timetable up, I think. One of the things he would tell Trump, probably if Trump made the trip, is just that. I'm sure Putin knows it. I'm sure they've coordinated on it. I'm sure they've worked out a way that the ruble's probably going to be right in there for quite a while, if not tandem with the renminbi until they fall apart, which is, I think, inevitable. But it won't be until the empire's diminished considerably in its ability to sanction, which Xi Jinping abhors. He hates sanctions. He's even said he hates them. And I don't blame him. You know, here we sit with 2 billion people under sanctions. And if you read that study, we have killed 38 million people, half of whom are women and children, over the past years since about 2000, about the time of 9/11. With our sanctions, we have killed 38 million people.
Larry, do you think US sanctions policy is driven by the system itself, regardless of who's in power? And could it eventually lose effectiveness as targeted countries adapt?
Exactly. And what it's going to do to us, of course, is it's going to cause us to have to deal directly with our colossal debt, now approaching $40 trillion in aggregate. We're going to have to deal with that without being able to have others buy our debt, buy our currency, have to function in our currency, giving us the leverage to deal with that debt, even if it gets to the gargantuan totals it is now. Once that's relieved, once that pressure is off, our debt is going to go in terms of our ability to deal with it, and this way in terms of its increase. I mean, you talk about not being able to buy a loaf of bread in Weimar, Germany. We're going to be in that kind of boat if we don't stop this and get a hold on. And this is all the Congress. You know, you can say Donald Trump should be doing something about this, and I will, but I don't expect him to do anything. Our Congress is so guilty in this, and I don't let anybody out of this guilt. They've all been watching this. They've all been signing the checks. They've all been robbing the Treasury year after year after year. And, you know, my father used to say, beware of the Republicans because they'll kill you. Beware of the Democrats because they'll steal you blind. Well, now both parties will kill you and steal you blind. That's where the American taxpayer is today, caught between absolute ineffective parties in terms of physical probity. House of Representatives is supposed to be the place that deals with appropriations. Johnson wouldn't have a clue how to do this, even if he wanted to do it. So we're in trouble, Nima, and I keep telling people this, you know, watch out. When we collapse, we're going to collapse with a loud bang, and people's lives are going to be ruined. It's not going to just be $8 a gallon at the pump. It's going to be you can't afford anything. You can't even afford to eat. You can't afford to have a roof over your head. You certainly can't afford all those things you've been thinking about, like a college education for your children and so forth. That's where we're headed. And we're doing it to ourselves. There's no reason whatsoever that we couldn't have worked this out to where the collapse, if you will, is so soft and gentle that we wouldn't even know it was happening by and large, and we could walk our way through it and walk our way out of it. I'm not saying we'll ever be the number one power in the world again. China's got that berth sewed up right now, but she's going to find that's not all that's cracked up to be. She's going to find that's a tough row to hoe. So it would be better, far better, if there was some sort of consortium put together, as I've said so many times, with Beijing, with Moscow, with Tokyo, perhaps, I would even bring Canada and Brazil into it, and anybody else that wanted to actually come into it with the right faith and manage things like nuclear weapons and the climate crisis, because we're going to destroy ourselves with both if we don't do something about it. And the only way we're going to do anything about it is together. How the hell are we going to deal with these problems if we're all fighting each other? If we're in wars like we're in right now, wars of choice, wars that don't need to be, wars that we started, wars that we set up, wars that our little puppy pipsqueak Israel helped us to get into. We have to stop this.
If neither side can accept the other's demands, what do you see as the real outcome of this war so far, especially with moves like Iran asserting control over Hormuz and the pressure on US bases in the Gulf?
Disaster for both sides. Disaster for both sides. Iran, because it's lost so many people, lost so many cultural facilities, lost so many educational facilities, medical facilities, war crimes all, and us because we don't know what we're doing. And we're frittering away what little power we have left in several dimensions. And there is no end to it, as you just pointed out. So what we're going to do is we're going to be beggared, both of us, one on each side of the canal, one on each side of the strait, if you will, with our Saudi allies behind us, essentially as beggared as we are, and staring at each other with this kind of 1,000-mile stare, you know. No one's going to win this war. No one is going to win this war. I would say that Haaretz was right when it said all Iran has to do to win is not lose. So if that's a victory, Pyrrhic though it might be, then Iran will have the victory, but it will be Pyrrhic. That is to say, they won't like it very much because it's going to be just so bloody. And Donald Trump seems like he's intent on making it bloody to the very end and destroying his own country in the process.
Larry, could a third major outcome of this war be a deep and growing division among GCC countries, and how serious is that risk?
But I don't want to sound flippant, but that's secondary, I think, to a country like Iran, which outweighs all those countries combined. And I mean that. I sincerely mean that. It outweighs all those countries combined. And the United States, which is, getting ready to celebrate its 250th anniversary and committing suicide. It really is tragic. It's not like Adolf Hitler in Germany and Tojo in Japan and Churchill in Britain and Roosevelt in America and Stalin even in Russia. It's very different. It's very different. And it's not like it hadn't happened before. There were empires in the past that I won't say everybody loved them, but they were better than others. And when they disappeared, there were people who lamented their disappearing who were not necessarily subjects of the empire. They were others who dealt with that empire. Cyrus the Great, for example, and what the Persian Empire represented at that time. There were people who were really sorry to see that calmness, that security, that economic success, such as it was in those days, go away. And to see leaders come and take the helm who were anything but. Same thing happened in the Mughal Empire. There have been empires that went out with a bang and suicidally, and then there have been empires that just sort of faded away. And they faded away principally because they could not pass on the baton of leadership to anyone competent enough to maintain the empire in a reasonable fashion. Do we see something like that happening right here, right now? And I would say Iran's got a problem there too, to a certain extent. Iran's got to find a new leadership also. And I don't think it's necessarily going to come from the war party, as it were. I don't mean the IRGC. It might well come from the IRGC, but I think the new leadership for Iran, and I'm talking about Iran in the 21st century writ positively, if that's possible. I mean, we're all going down if we don't do something about nuclear weapons and the climate. But that Iran has to be led by a younger leadership, a leadership that's sitting in the wings right now, if you will, and wants what Iran wanted at the turn of the 20th century, a real democracy.
Larry, how do you interpret Pete Hegseth's frequent statements? Are they strategic messaging or just bluster?
I need some of his booze at night. I need some of his booze, which puts you totally out of things, I think. I mean, geez. I always thought, I'm going to tell you the truth here. I always thought that using dolphins in a manner that was suicidal for them, strapping explosives on them or whatever, the very depth of depravity, human depravity. Dolphins, in my estimation, and I've had a lot of interplay with dolphins in the ocean, are smarter than we are, far smarter than we are. dolphins could teach us a few things about life. So what do? We strap explosives on them and send them out to kill a ship or whatever. I mean, that's a perfect example of what Pete Hegseth stands for. Not that he started it, but it's a perfect example of what Pete Hegseth stands for. Kill them all, no quarter. War crimes? War. Don't talk to me about war crimes. Be no Nuremberg tribunal for me.
Larry, if Iran's message is leave us alone, but Trump is still talking about arming internal opposition, does this signal a path toward de-escalation or continued pressure and confrontation?
He's being lied to. He's being lied to by the people around this situation who've been lying about it ever since 1978 and probably before that. But they have been lying about the Iranian people. They've been lying about the situation in Iran on the ground year after year after year. There are people who send money to the Mujahideen Ekak, the MEK. There are people who send money to the Pahlavi family. There are people who think they know more about Iran, and some of them are Iranian Americans, than people living in Iran. And generally speaking, they're the same kind of people that we have in our country who are so satiated with their own importance, and in many cases, their own wealth. I've met many of them, that they think that's what would make the country better for their return, were they to return. It's sick. It really is sick. And Trump's listening to these people, just like he listens to Laura Loomer and others like her. He's listening to these people. Either that or he is the dumbest son of a bitch on the face of the earth.
Do you think Europe can play a more effective role in today's global tensions?
Europe's as broken as we are. Cast your eye upon it from the top to the bottom, from the left to the right or right to the left, east, west, west, east, north, south, south, north. They're as bad as we are. Individually, they may be worse. I don't know what's going to happen. The Western world is reacting to this inexorable shift of power away from it and to the East with the emotions of a 2-year-old and with the cerebral power of a 4-year-old. No, I can't say that. That's an insult to 4-year-olds.
Do you think continued fighting between Lebanon and Israel would ease or worsen the overall situation, including Gaza and the West Bank?
I think I heard that the president said last night, the president of Lebanon said last night, until Israel honors the ceasefire, we're not stopping. We're not honoring it either. So I don't know what that means. I suspect it means every Lebanese with a weapon is going to take it up and go out and fight the Israelis. I wish that were the case. But he said, I'm not in this anymore if Israel's going to keep on doing what it's doing. There's no ceasefire in Lebanon. Very much still there. And I think I told you, or I said it on one podcast, and the other person knew the area well, so he kind of laughed. But one Lebanese called me and said, I wish the Syrians had come back. It was safer when the Syrians were here.